What is a woman? Can you tell me that?
Let's find out as we take a look at some of the most horrible human experiments of all time. Now, before we begin, I need to give the disclaimer that what we're about to talk about in this video gets dark. Like, dark. This honestly might be some of the most disturbing stuff I've talked about on this channel, and I'm the severed head guy. But this stuff actually happened. And this is a good example of just how far down human beings can go. It's worth facing, even if it's uncomfortable. And it's gonna get uncomfortable. Grigory Marianovsky was a Russian biochemist who ran a lab that specialized in poison research. And by that I mean he was finding new and innovative ways to poison people to death. The facility went by several names: Laboratory 1, Laboratory 12, and Kamera, meaning cell or chamber in Russian, and it was supervised by a high-ranking official named Gingrich Yagoda, not to be confused with Grogu Yoda. But it was Marianovsky who carried out these experiments, and it seems like this was actually a job he was born to do. I mean, his PhD was actually titled Biological Activity of the Products of Interaction of Mustard Gas with Human Skin Tissues. He chose that for his thesis. So he brought that zeal for poisons with him to the lab, where they carried out involuntary experiments on prisoners from the gulags, including chemicals like digitoxin, curare, cyanide, mustard gas, and ricin. Ultimately, what they were looking for was an odorless and tasteless combination of things that could kill somebody without being detected. And they basically put the poisons in vitamins that they gave to the prisoners, so the prisoners had no idea that they were taking poisons at all. That is, until they were unable to breathe or their heart stopped beating. It's literally impossible to know how many prisoners died as a result of this testing, but due to their research, this actually led to some high-profile assassinations in the real world, including Bulgarian dissident Gregory Markov, who was famously killed by a poison pellet to his leg that was administered by a modified umbrella. Yeah, some secret agent literally just jabbed him in the leg with an umbrella as they walked by in the street, and it administered a little tiny pellet with ricin in it. He died in the hospital 4 days later. We still don't know the exact location of the lab because it was kept secret, but a KGB defector in 1954 said that it was near a police station in Lubyanka. In fact, some people think that the lab, or some version of the lab, is still experimenting on people to this very day. But that's the Soviet Union. They're evil. We all know that. The United States would never... Oh boy. Yes, shocking, I know, but the United States doesn't come out completely clean in this either. There's a few human experiment programs that happen, including the San Jose Project in World War II. San Jose Island, or Isla San Jose, is in the Gulf of Panama, and in World War II the United States had a base there, and at this base they conducted experiments on how mustard gas affected the human body. On humans. These particular humans were U.S. troops, which were kind of voluntold to do it, which in itself is not that big a deal. I mean, soldiers put their bodies on the line in a million different ways, sure, but what makes this one a little bit sus is how they chose the troops. They did it by race. African American and Puerto Rican soldiers were singled out for these experiments because it was thought at the time that their darker skin would make them more resistant to mustard gas and thus make them more valuable on the front lines in Japan. And Japanese American soldiers were tested on to see how mustard gas would affect enemy soldiers. Around 60,000 enlisted men were experimented on with mustard gas during World War II, meaning we probably gassed more of our own soldiers than we did enemy soldiers. And I should point out it wasn't just minorities that were tested on, white soldiers were tested on in control groups as well. And the soldiers were exposed to mustard gas in 3 different ways. Patch tests, applying liquid mustard gas directly to a subject's skin, field tests, which exposed subjects to gas outside in simulated combat scenarios, and chamber tests, literally putting soldiers in a chamber and piping mustard gas inside of it. That sounds horrible. On a quick side note, this buddy of mine was in the Army, and he told me all about the basic training and how they put them in the tear gas chamber to make them, get exposed to tear gas so that they understood what it felt like in combat situations. And when he was talking about how like it was horrible and it stung your eyes and you were just puking and just snot was flying out of your face and it was the worst experience of his entire life. But afterwards, he said, I've never breathed freer in my life. Like all the mucus came out of me. And so now every time I get sick and I'm laying down and I can't breathe and I'm all clogged up and everything, I just think, God, just put me in the gas chamber and get it over with, Yeah, mustard gas is way worse than that. Mustard gas causes blisters to form immediately when it touches the skin or the inside of your lungs. This isn't something you just cough out and then you're done with it. This damages things permanently. People who are exposed to mustard gas often come down with things like asthma and emphysema later on because of the damage to the lungs. But even worse than that, it also damages DNA, which leads to leukemia and skin cancers. Mustard gas was first used widely in World War I by the Germans. The gas has a yellow-brown appearance and can smell like garlic, horseradish, or, well, mustard. And it was after the Germans used mustard gas on Polish citizens in 1939 that the U.S. decided we needed our own stockpile. By the end of the war, we had produced more than 100,000 tons of various types of mustard gas, including 20,000 tons of Lewisite, 100 tons of nitrogen mustard, and 87,000 tons of sulfur mustard. The mustard gas experiments were shocking. But what might be even more shocking is how these soldiers were treated afterwards. Despite being told that they would be taken care of afterwards, and despite the permanent injuries they sustained, they still weren't able to get any kind of disability compensation from the Veterans Administration because the tests were carried out in secret. It wasn't until NPR did a report on this in 2015 that the survivors finally had their stories told, and the Department of Veteran Affairs finally stepped in and decided to do something about it. That story won a Peabody, by the way. Of course, it wasn't just Americans that did this. The British also did something with Indian soldiers around that same time, also for the same reasons. They thought that the darker skin would make them more resistant to mustard gas. It didn't, and thousands of Indian soldiers were permanently scarred for life. For the love of God, melanin does not turn you into Wolverine. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service began to recruit black men aged 25 to 60 to participate in the study. This study was done in conjunction with the Tuskegee Institute, and most of the participants were picked in the surrounding areas of Macon County, mostly poor and illiterate sharecroppers. Its purpose was to study the natural history of syphilis, how it affected a person over time, and how it spread through communities. And the name of this study was the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. People generally just call it the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment now. Fewer syllables. They basically just chose 600 people. 399 of them had syphilis and 201 of them didn't, so they were in the control group. And the idea was they were just going to watch them over a long period of time and see how the disease progressed. Now, there's nothing really all that sketchy about that. It's not like they gave people syphilis or anything. They already had it. And just for context, syphilis is a bacterial infection, and this was pre-antibiotics, so it was untreatable at the time. It is a sexually transmitted disease, so it's usually spread by sexual contact, and it can remain dormant in the body for years before it finally starts to really take over. But once it does, if it's not treated, it's a horror show. People with secondary syphilis break out with rashes and wart-like lesions all over the body and death, controlling the spread of syphilis. In fact, spoiler alert, this is not the last time you're going to hear about syphilis in this video. So to the guys in this study, the die had been cast. There wasn't really any way to treat it. There wasn't anything to do about it. So to them, this was just a way to contribute to the scientific understanding of it. And they also got free meals and basic medical care out of it. And all that seems fine, I guess. The problem is, in 1947, they discovered that syphilis can be treated with penicillin. And they just kind of didn't ever tell the people in the study. Yeah, you know that thing that you have that's going to deform your body and make you go insane? Well, there's a way that we can fix it, but I think we'd rather just see what happens. Yeah, the flawed thinking that led to that decision is the same flawed thinking that led to this whole study in the first place. They thought that the black community was more prone to syphilis infections than other people. Yeah, so that's how the researchers justified the project. They called it a study in nature. And they also argued that they didn't think that they'd be able to talk people in the black community to take the treatments for syphilis. But they also went way further than that. Like, they really went out of their way to make sure that these people didn't possibly get any kind of treatment for their syphilis. They even went as far as to give them fake drugs that didn't actually do anything. So the people in the study thought that they were being treated and, being taken care of, and they weren't. But on top of that, they actually gave lists of the people in the study to all the doctors in Macon County, and they also appealed to the Alabama Health Department to prevent them from getting treated. They were told not to treat these people for syphilis if they came in. And actually, when some of these men got drafted into World War II, and the military tested them and found out they had syphilis, instead of just treating them like they would any other draftee, the researchers got the military to send them back home so that they wouldn't get treated, thus denying them the opportunity to get tested on with mustard gas. These men were allowed to just deteriorate unnecessarily for 40 years. Until 1972, when the New York Times ran a piece about it. At that point, only 74 of the original 600 were still alive. And also in that time, 40 of their wives had been infected and 19 of their kids were born with congenital syphilis. This led to public outrage and a lawsuit by the NAACP, and in 1974, Congress passed the National Research Act and formed the Office of Human Research Protections to keep this from ever happening again. Remember earlier when I said that the UK tested mustard gas on their own troops? Well, strap in, Brits, because they tested on the general public as well. The Guardian reported in 2002 that the UK's Ministry of Defence turned large parts of the country into a giant laboratory to conduct a series of secret germ warfare tests on the public. These tests took place between 1940 and 1979 and involved deadly chemicals, microorganisms, and an unsuspecting public. They were told the tests were for air pollution and weather research projects. The tests were carried out by Porton Down, which is their biological weapons lab, and actually the oldest biological weapons lab in the world. But the point was to gauge the UK's vulnerability in case the Soviets were to attack with a germ warfare agent. When the story broke, the Ministry of Defense claimed that what they actually used were alternatives to biological agents that were harmless. But many families who had children born with birth defects disagreed. One test that was carried out between 1955 and 1963 involved dumping large amounts of zinc-cadmium sulfide on the general public. Zinc-cadmium sulfide is a fluorescent powder which makes it easy to trace under UV light, and they used it to kind of trace how biological agents might move through the public if it was dumped over people. The problem with that is that cadmium is known to be carcinogenic. There was also the story of a military ship called the Ice Whale that sprayed E. coli bacteria in a 5 to 10 mile radius around England's south coast throughout the 60s. Other experiments outlined in the report include Serratia marcescens bacteria with an anthrax simulant and phenol sprayed in the air in large quantities, bacteria released at lunchtime on the London Underground, and germs attached to spiders' webs in several locations around the country, including in London's West End. Now granted, there may have been some data collected that would have been useful in the event of an attack from the Soviet Union, but that attack never happened. So the only country that actually sprayed biological poisons over the people of the UK was the UK government itself. Yeah, it's all fun and games till the Nazis show up. The Nazis, with all their death camps, had an ample supply of experimental subjects to test on, which they managed over the years to completely dehumanize, basically treating human beings as nothing more than lab rats. Millions suffered under the Nazi regime, but perhaps none so more than twins. Because they were obsessed with racial purity, which led to some twisted and perverted ideas about genetics, and one Nazi doctor in particular thought that he could find all the answers he needed about genetics by experimenting on twins. His name is Joseph Mengele, and he has gone down as one of the biggest monsters in history. When he arrived at Auschwitz in 1943, he was considered one of the top doctors in the country, but he soon earned a new nickname, the Angel of Death. He would scour the incoming prisoners coming into Auschwitz looking for twins, and ultimately he found 3,000 of them to do experiments on. Of those, only 200 survived. Life for twins at the camp was actually better than other people at first. They didn't have to do any hard labor, they got to go to classes, and they even got to play soccer every once in a while. But then the trucks would come to take them for Mengele's experiments. It would start with measurement tests in which every single part of the twins' body were measured in great detail. This would take hours. And they would then be subjected to, basically any crazy idea that Mengele had, including transferring blood from one twin to the other, injecting chemicals in the eyes to try to turn them loose, these would easily lead to infection and blindness. Injecting diseases like type tuberculosis in one twin and then the other to see what would happen. And if one twin died during the experiment, the other one was killed to compare and examine the disease's effects. Also performing surgeries like amputations, castration, and organ removal without anesthesia. The twin experiments were sadly just the beginning. For example, at the Dachau camp, they did high-altitude tests to try to figure out exactly how high up, say, a German pilot could bail out of a damaged plane. So yeah, they just stuck prisoners in a low-pressure chamber and then just lowered the pressure until they died. Because science. They also conducted hypothermia tests, basically putting prisoners in cold water and made it colder and colder until they died. And also they did seawater tests, making them drink seawater until they died. At other camps, they infected prisoners with diseases like malaria, typhoid fever, and hepatitis to test treatments on it. At the Ravensbrück camp, doctors conducted bone drying experiments and sterilization trials, including everything from x-rays to surgeries to drugs, all of them doing psychological and physical damage. The human experiments were just part of the Nazi atrocities that took place during World War II, which led to the Nuremberg Code, which now works as sort of a foundation for ethical human experimentation ever since. It's really hard to imagine a more cruel and inhumane system than the Nazi death camps. But believe it or not, there was one. And it took place about the same time on the other side of the world. Unit 731 was Japanese naval biological weapons lab Japanese by China until 1938, although the Japanese government wouldn't acknowledge the project was placed there until 1984. Lieutenant Shirakichi led the operation to use prisoners of war as local villagers and guinea pigs, or they were referred to by the researchers logs, as if flesh and blood beings bring nothing more than injuries on log to them. So what kind of experiments were done there? Let's just start with frostbite testing. Simply put, the prisoners had their limbs put in ice until they froze solid. Doctors would then try different ways to rewarm the limbs, sometimes putting it in warm water, sometimes just putting it over and over in a flame. And there were times when the prisoners were just left untreated overnight to see if the blood would eventually warm the limb back up, or just leave them outside in the winter until their limbs fell off. Now, if that's cruel enough for you, they also performed vivisections. Now, if you don't know what a vivisection is, it's basically an autopsy on a living person. Their reasoning was they wanted to see how diseases like cholera and typhus had living tissue before it began to decompose. So yeah, they would tie prisoners to a table and remove their organs, examine them while they were still alive. With no anesthesia, of course. And they do crazy things like crush limbs to see how long it would take gangrene to set in, or amputate a limb, attach it to the body, really centipede stuff. Sometimes they would just tie a prisoner to a pole and do weapons testing on them with pistols, machine guns, and grenades, and flamethrowers. And prisoners were placed in gas chambers to be tested on nerve agents. Or they would just lock prisoners in rooms without food or water to see how long they could survive without eating and drinking. Some other experiments included forcing prisoners to only drink seawater, giving prisoners mismatched human or animal blood injections in order to study clotting and transfusions, exposing human subjects to prolonged x-rays, which resulted in sterilization and death, and placing human centrifuges and spinning them at ultra-high speeds until they lost consciousness or died. And then there were the syphilis experiments. Told you it was coming back. And just like syphilis, it's coming back worse. Way worse. Because in this case, they did actually infect prisoners and then withheld treatment to see how the disease progressed. But they also wanted to study the disease's transmission, which means that they, I've got to say this line. They forced male prisoners with syphilis to rape female prisoners until they got syphilis. On a similar note, the guards would often rape female prisoners to get them pregnant, and then they would do weapons testing on them, to see how much differently a pregnant woman responds to getting shot. Or they would give the pregnant woman various diseases and cut the fetus out to see how it affected the fetus. And last but not least, Unit 731 developed plague bombs by packing plague-infested fleas into clay bomb casings. Japanese bombers deployed the bombs over a Chinese village called Kuzhou in 1940. More than 2,000 people died of the plague there, and another 1,000 died in a nearby town.
Check out this verbo. Oh, man. Look at me. Here I am. Right where I belong.
This video is supported by Brian. Told you there was going to be another one. So last month I did a video about the Victorian era and how it was utter insanity, and I wasn't really sure how I was going to do with a bit of a departure for this channel. Just a little rabbit hole that I had fallen down, and I thought it was really interesting. I didn't know if anybody else would care about it, but yeah, it turns out it did pretty well. Turns out you guys are freaks too. Like I said in this video, there was actually a ton of stuff that I cut out of that video and saved for yet another video, which is kind of unfortunate because the stuff that I cut out is actually some of the more salacious stuff I ran across. Because this focuses mostly on the health and beauty fads that the Victorians got into. Yeah, if you think that the way they decorated their homes was crazy, just wait till you see what they did with their own bodies. One of the biggest takeaways from this video was that the Victorian era was a period of transition, where old ways collided with new ways to produce a very interesting time. And one of the places where that becomes the most obvious is in their understanding of disease. In some ways they were improving their knowledge by leaps and bounds, but with new knowledge requires an understanding of how to implement that knowledge, which they did not have at all. And because of that, number one, their medicine was completely insane. Have you ever heard anybody say that they know just enough about something to be dangerous? Yeah, that was the entire medical field Victorian era. I talked about this a little bit in my video about John Harvey Kellogg, which is definitely worth a watch if you haven't seen it. But yeah, medicine in the Victorian age, the late 1800s or so, was very much a throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks approach. Yeah, that's the one where I talk about the doctor that had a cure for male infertility, where he implanted goat testicles into guys' scrotums. It's a real thing. So the germ theory of medicine was pretty much brand new, but they still didn't really have ways of combating it. Antibiotics are still quite a ways off. But they had figured out how to extract drugs from plants that makes you feel better. So they did that. A lot. And from that you get things like cocaine toothache drops, which you could buy on the counter. Cocaine was actually in a lot of stuff back then. Again, did a whole video on that. I feel like I'm going to reference a lot of my old videos in this. I seem to go back to this one quite a bit. It was the same time period. And one of the most popular items in the day, for parents anyway, was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. It was something that they gave to kids who couldn't sleep or were teething. And the reason it was so popular is because it worked. Within a few minutes of giving this to a kid, they were calm and quiet, laid out. It was like a miracle. Did I say miracle? I meant morphine. It was morphine. Yeah, you know how in Saving Private Ryan, when the medic knew that a soldier wasn't going to make it, he would basically euthanize him by injecting a bunch of morphine into him? Yeah, it was that. For kids. Okay, I'm exaggerating a little, but it was morphine. Now, similarly, if you're a lady of the day and you're dealing with painful menstrual cramps and whatnot, the Pond's Tampon Company has just a thing for you, because they bake their tampons in opium and belladonna extract. Belladonna is also known as deadly nightshade, because it's poisonous. But it does cause muscles to relax, so the opium would get rid of the pain, and the belladonna would cause the muscles to stop cramping. So, yeah, I mean, it was almost a good idea. Actually, I'm sure it worked wonders in the short term, but for the long term, I mean, well, there's a reason you don't see them on the shelves today. Now, one thing that Victorian doctors were really into at the time was phrenology, with the idea that the shape of your head determined what kind of person you were and what kind of health you had. They had maps of the human head with various areas dedicated to different personality traits, and it was thought if your skull had bumps along those spots, that it was an indicator of what kind of person you were. This was especially used to determine criminality. It was thought that they could tell by the shape of your skull whether you had inherent criminal traits, and they would actually use this to put some people in asylums. In fact, the guy who invented mugshots first started doing it as a way to sort of figure out certain facial characteristics that were common amongst criminals. The idea being that if you could figure out these common traits, then police could, arrest people before they commit crimes. It was only later that they realized that it was helpful in identifying repeat offenders, so they kept doing it. And as I've talked about before, body snatching was big at the time. Getting your body to science wasn't really a thing back then, so medical schools kind of relied on grave robbers to go and dig people out of graves that were fresh in the ground. Which is why you sometimes see old graves with like iron bars around them. It wasn't to prevent vampires from coming up, or zombies as some people say. It was to keep grave robbers from getting into the graves. But perhaps the craziest health fad occurred right at the end of the Victorian age, when radioactivity was discovered in 1896. They knew what it was, but they didn't know that it caused cancer. And the way they found out that it caused cancer was because they put it in everything. They saw this natural energy coming out of rocks, so surely if you put that in your body, it would give you vim and vigor. So yeah, they put radium makeup, thorium in toothpaste. You could take radium pills, drink it in a drink called Radithor. And if you want a real kick out of it, you can drink it out of radium glass. Yeah, girls working with radium in factories started getting sick, the famous radium girls I've talked about before. And people that were drinking that Radithor began to notice that it was starting to eat through their jawbones, and in the case of amateur Eben Byers, his jaw fell off. This is an actual guy who drank 3 bottles of Radithor a day for years. Probably wasn't the glow he was going for. Now, this was about a decade or so after the Victorian era would officially end, but Victorians, they sacrificed a lot for beauty as well. Number 2, they did some crazy stuff to look good. Today, if you were to come home to find your friends...
I was eating because I was stressed out, candy bars and chips and donuts, gaining weight. But since I'm
sitting in front of you in a corset and lace stockings and high heels, friend, you better put that chalupa down because she's got other plans. In the Victorian age, that wouldn't change Tuesday. Victorian women wore corsets all the time, sometimes even in their sleep, in an attempt to cinch their waist as small as possible. Now, this is still today, don't get me wrong. There's whole communities of people that are into this kind of thing, and that's cool, do you? But the Victorians took it to extreme. They were obsessed with it. This is where that whole thing about women fainting because they get surprised came from. The idea being that they were so cinched in that their blood pressure would jump when, their heart rate increased and they would pass out. It's debated still whether or not this was really a thing, but it's talked about. But yeah, to the Victorians, there was nothing more important than having a tiny waist, which they would exaggerate by putting a bustle underneath their dress. More on crazy fashion stuff later. But yeah, something else that they were really into was having a doe-eyed look to go along with their ant waists. And so what they would do to create a doe-eyed look was going back to that old belladonna, they would put belladonna juice in their eyes. But I feel the need to reiterate that belladonna is poisonous, and many women wouldn't mind doing this. They'd also apparently put lemon and orange juice in their eyes because they thought the steam that it was cleaning their eyes when actually acid eating away at their corneas. They also really valued pale skin. The whiter the better, because that was associated with wealth. Because if you didn't have a lot of money and you had to work, then you would probably be working outside, the sun would beat down on you and darken your skin. If you were wealthy, you didn't have to work. You could just, sit on the couch in your living room eating bonbons with your pale ass. So soaps often promised to whiten your skin. They would use white makeup, but if you were really dedicated to that pale life, you'd use arsenic complexion wafers. Yes, arsenic, the thing that wound up in their wallpapers I talked about in the last video, killed thousands of them. Well, they also openly consumed it in arsenic complexion wafers. The idea being that in low doses, arsenic can limit your body's ability to produce red blood cells. Like a dying person. But less red blood cells under the skin meant paler skin. Because we all know anemia is the sexiest disease. These extreme beauty hacks are, of course, mostly aimed at women, but feel sorry for women of the age right now. Just wait. It gets worse. Number three. Women had it rough. Okay, so I talked a second ago about the corset craze of the Victorian era. It turns out that's actually a pretty good metaphor because women were pretty squeezed for options during that day. I'm sure it's a surprise to nobody to know that the women of the Victorian era had fewer rights than they do today, but just to give an idea of how controlled they were, consider Annette Kellerman. She was an Australian actress who got arrested in the early 1900s for going to a beach in an inappropriately revealing outfit. Oh my God, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that was... I hope this doesn't get demonetized. But seriously, women in the Victorian era were expected to be in full skirts and pantaloons at the beach, and you could only remove the skirt when you were in waist-up water, and then you had to put it back on before you got out, and in the meantime, I guess you just held on to it. But in fact, many beaches provided little changing rooms on wheels that they called bathing machines, where you'd get in on the beach fully dressed, they'd wheel you out into the water, you would change clothes on the way, and then you could exit on the other side and swim in privacy. Which is especially because most of the beaches were segregated by gender, like men were allowed on the beaches, the women, whatever. But sexually, they were crazy repressed back then, both the men and the women, but especially the women. Like, sex was only supposed to be for procreation, even for married couples. You were not supposed to enjoy it. It was considered unseemly and whorish for a woman to enjoy sex, even with her husband. In fact, they believed that women couldn't have orgasms. And pretty much any kind of female unhappiness was labeled hysteria. And the doctors had a way of relieving this hysteria. It was called a pelvic massage. Again, I covered this in a previous video, but a pelvic massage was where a doctor would have a woman lay down, and then he would manipulate her downstairs with his hand until she had a release of hysteria. Not an orgasm. We all know they can't have orgasms. No. It was a release of hysteria. Yeah. How bad was it for women back in the Victorian days? An orgasm was a medical procedure. That's how bad it was. It was also a small problem that many women back in the day were just considered property to their husbands or their fathers. In fact, men who wanted a divorce but couldn't afford a divorce had the option of selling their wives. And this was actually done at a public auction, just like livestock, and whoever it is that won this auction got to have this wife. This was now his wife, and she had no choice in the matter. This was actually documented in the Thomas Hardy novel, Casterbridge. And if you're really ready to have your mind blown, this wasn't that long ago. The last reported case of this was in Leeds in 1913. There are people alive today that were around when it was legal to sell your wife. But I don't know, maybe as a way to sort of deal with that whole situation, women of Victorian days indulged in some pretty crazy fashion. There's the aforementioned corset and tiny waist craze that I was talking about, but yeah, they would also include a bustle. The bustle was a little wire floof that they would put above that would cause the dress to color out their eye behind them. Kind of made it look like they just farted. It served other purposes. It kept the tips of the dress off the ground, and I guess depending on how you look at it, it could be seen as an act of modesty, like it's hiding your actual figure, or the exact opposite. It's supposed to be like a, Victorian dump truck. But believe it or not, this was a minimized version of something that came before it. Really popular in the 1850s to 1870s, women wore these steel cages under the dresses called crinolines that flared the dress out up to 6 feet wide. It was a ridiculous fashion, and it was criticized at the time as well, but its merits are debated. Some women enjoyed wearing them because it kept their legs cooler with all the heavy material lifted off of them. It kind of created this space underneath there. That meant they could move their legs around a little easier and maybe walk around a bit more. And the wide dresses gave them more personal space. They kept the creepers off at parties. But on the other side, they were big and bulky and put women in literal cages. But the worst thing was, say it with me, they killed a lot of people. Crinolines caught fire constantly. Homes at the time were heated and lit by fireplaces and candles. You can imagine trying to navigate around a space like that with a giant dress that flares out that wide and knocking stuff over. And the dress, by the way, was made of very flammable material. In fact, it's estimated around 3,000 women died every year from dress fires. On a lighter note, one popular trend in the 1800s was for women to wear hats with birds on them. And I don't mean patterns of birds, I mean an actual bird. And jewelry made out of insects.